without further ado, it's my privilege to turn the call over to your host and moderator today, Burr Sutter. Burr, the call is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody. We look forward to having another great crowd to talk about EE6 and of course things JBoss and JBoss AS7 related. We've had many great sessions over the last several weeks and several months, and I look forward to having another great session today. So we definitely have the key guys behind some very interesting technology. Andrew Rubinger being a core developer on App Server 7, as well as our guy around shrink wrap. And Aslak is also on the line with us today, coming in from Norway, and he'll be able to answer questions and help us with any kind of deep dive we need around Arquillian. So just bear that in mind. We have a lot of good stuff that's been happening. You guys have probably heard about the announcement of JBoss App Server 7. I just put a screenshot up of it here for the landing page that's out there, and 7 reasons to love JBoss Application Server 7. So I encourage you to look at that content, download it, give it a try. And also in the download section, there's a series of quick starts that you would use as examples to get up and running quickly with EE6. So just keep that in mind. Other bit of news you guys probably just heard from us last week was AS7 and EE6 in the cloud and running at OpenShift. If you guys are interested in that technology, that'll be our next session coming up from this particular series of webinars with Scott Stark and Tobias coming up soon. So one thing to keep in mind, this is JBoss Developer Series. We do presentations and demonstrations by our development team for your development team. Our key URL there is jboss.org/webinars. And that is our page where we update regularly to basically say, here's the next event, and here is the next item, or the next bit of content that is now available. So if you wish to find a recording, the recordings will be linked there also. That's a very common question we get is, can I get a recording in this session? And if you go to jboss.org/webinars, you'll find it there. Also, if you follow us on Twitter at JBoss Developer, we will send out announcements as they become available. Not only announcements about new projects and stuff that's happening, major betas or major updates to an existing JBoss project, but we will also let you know that we have a new webinar scheduled and what its URL will be. And then if you're more of an email follower, I'd encourage you to sign up on the JBoss Developer newsletter list. That's the second checkbox. I know it's rather small there on the slide, but if you go to jboss.org/webinars, you'll see the link there. Do subscribe to the email list. There are tens and tens of thousands of people on that email list already, and you will get an email from me, and that information will give you how to register for our next event. And then if you just simply go to Vimeo, vimeo.com/jbossdeveloper, you'll not only find all the recordings for these kind of sessions, but we have numerous recordings from JudCon, JBoss World, several that are related to JBoss AS7 and JBoss AS7 on OpenShift that have been published, and we will continue to pump new content into that channel all the time. So if you like recorded content, desktop shares where people are screencasting, showing what they're doing, that's a fantastic way to go. But we also have just real video recording of our presenters speaking at JBoss World or JudCon, and there's some great content. I encourage you to go check it out. All right, so here we are in our series. We've been doing this now for probably 18 months. We've been moving along at a great clip, and you can just see some of our past sessions here. We did on May 18th, June 15th, and then, of course, stuff we did around AS7 and EE6 with Jason Green and Pete, and Brian Stansbury, Bella Bond, Paul. So we've had a great crowd of developers. You've seen a lot of our guys come out and speak about the topics they care most about. Thomas Diesler and David are great examples of that. They talked about OSGI just recently. But today we have Andrew, who's going to deep dive into Arquillian and AS7 and how to be the most productive developer you can be with EE6 technology on App Server 7. So high octane development is what we titled that session. That is today. September 7th is the session I already mentioned, JBoss Platform as a Service, basically JBoss running at OpenShift and in the cloud with Scott Stark. And if you guys remember that name, or hopefully you remember that name, Scott is one of the founding fathers of JBoss, and he continues to work with us here, and he will be a key part of that presentation. So I'm excited to have Scott on the line. It's the first time we've had him in one of these kind of sessions in several years. So that's fantastic. And Tobias comes to us. He's the cloud architect for Platform as a Service, and he comes to us from Makara. And so he's another great guy, and will be really fun to have on the line. And then September 21st, I'm making a promise here. We're going to deliver an HTML5 session. That's some content that I've been putting together personally. So we're going to have a great session on HTML5 and what it means to be an enterprise Java developer and using HTML5 as your client-side piece of your architecture. So So just keep all that on your calendar, and we will continue to pump out content and give you the speakers and presentations that you want to hear about. Feel free to email me. If you're on our email list, you all have my email address. Email me. I get tons of email from all you guys already. Feel free to email me and pound on me with emails and say, hey, I'd really like to hear more about this topic or that topic, and we'll try to go out and find those presenters and get them on the schedule. One thing to keep in mind about all our sessions here, this is about the JBoss community, not necessarily the JBoss enterprise side of the house. So we have two sides of the house. One is about the upstream community projects, where you will see a ton of innovation, release early, release often, lots of our core development team and the community development working together in a synergistic relationship to create not only the JBoss application server, but our projects like Arquillian or Seam Forge or the Seam project in general. You've seen the Weld project from us before, JBPM, Drools, all those projects live out there at jboss.org and also live in other areas. So we make contributions to Eclipse, and we make contributions to Glassfish. We make contributions with Google, and of course we have Hibernate here, hibernate.org, and Apache. So we work with a lot of open source communities, including the Spring community and the Rich Faces community, etc. And we will work with all those communities, and that's all our open source stuff, and that's what we're focused on here today, the leading, bleeding edge of technology to show you what's coming down the path. On the right-hand side of this slide is our enterprise side, and this is where we've taken an aggregate, if you will, of all those different pieces and projects that are running around out there. They're all moving at light speed at their individual streams. And we aggregate all that together, build the composite product out of that, test and certify that for certain use cases. For instance, Java EE is a good set of use cases. And then we make sure that that's certified across a number of JVMs, operating systems, and databases. That is the version that we can provide 24/7 support to you, making sure that we can get a patch to you as quickly as possible. So that's the enterprise side of the house, and that is the downstream side. So many of the things you hear about today will probably be in a future product, but feel free to ask that question if you need to, and I'll do my best to answer. But today we're not too focused on the enterprise side. We're trying to deal with the leading edge. So just bear that in mind. Questions and answers, well, hopefully answers, and questions and comments, feel free to hit that Q&A panel. I just put a screenshot of it here so you can see what it looks like. You just type in your question, hit the send button. That pops up for myself, Andrew, and Aslak, and then we'll take those on as we can. All right? Today's presenter, Andrew Rubinger. He's an advocate and speaker for testable enterprise Java development. He's actually a published author these days. He publishes for O'Reilly. The Enterprise Java EE6 3.1 book is a recent development for him, relatively recent, I should say, probably about a year ago. And now he's also part of our core development team for the app server. So we're very lucky to have Andrew today. He's a fantastic speaker. He's been traveling around a lot, speaking at various conferences and developer groups. So we're going to have a fantastic session with Andrew today. So Andrew, at this point, you're ready to get shared and get going.
Thanks very much, Bert. I really appreciate being here, and welcome to everyone who's joined us today. We're really very excited to be talking about some of these developments here. The key to developing with JBoss Application Server 7 comes really from many different facets, right? We want to be able to have an application server that is going to run fast, it's going to be efficient for you, and the other end of that is usability, developer usability. So what we're going to do today is focus primarily on that and also glaze over some of the finer points of the Application Server 7, right? So we'll start off a little bit about me. Again, my name is Andrew Rubinger. I can be reached at the email on screen or via Twitter at @ALRubinger. As Bert mentioned, I had written the Enterprise Java EE6 3.1 book for O'Reilly, published last year, and the examples for that we'll actually be seeing a few of today. They're published in an online open source repo, and they will be refactored to execute against AS7. So let's rewind this whole thing all the way back to the very beginning, and we'll go through some prerequisite course material, right? The whole point of the enterprise application platform that's offered in Java EE is because enterprise application development is very complex by its nature. It's difficult. You need to be worrying about multi-user environments. They need to be secure. They're probably multi-threaded, right? And if you're going to go write this on your own, you're probably going to get it wrong. In fact, I can nearly guarantee it, right? There's a lot to really consider, and there's a lot of testing that goes into place. So what I like to do is really take a look at the types of codes that we write and place it into three very broad categories, right? And these are your core concerns, your cross-cutting concerns, and your plumbing. The core concerns are, in my opinion, the most important. This is your business logic. You're paid to do this. No one else can do it for you. And these are the types of things that come for you in a requirements document, or they may come down from your boss and say, hey, the system needs to be able to process this, and you're going to send an email and register a user. That's not nearly generic enough for it to be handled by any type of a framework or anyone else. So this is where you want to spend most of your time, right? There are cross-cutting concerns. Now, these are called cross-cutting concerns because actually, if you were to model them, you'd see that they run straight perpendicular or orthogonal to your main concerns, right? And they may involve things like security management or enforcing transactions, just things that have to be in place, but you don't want to sprinkle about in your core concerns. You want to configure and apply them. And finally, you have plumbing. It gets your data from one place to another. I say it handles transformation without affecting state, meaning it takes some state data and it may put it into different forms. We see examples of this all the time. You see it whenever an HTTP request is made. You know, the servlet specification's job is to put this into the HTTP request object model. We see it in JPA. You know, we want to deal with a JPA entity object and then have that be transformed in some way to SQL, and then eventually the state makes it into the database, right? So you don't want to be spending your time doing plumbing at all. It's just copying data from one point to another, and the more you can push off to frameworks, the better off you really are. So if we were to take a look at these three things again, really, core concerns is where we want to face, put our face on most of the effort, right? In short, the less you write, the less you have to maintain, and your system gets smaller and much, much easier to go. So we take a look at component models as a solution, right? Component models, very simple. They run in a container, and I loosely define a container as something, as an application that runs other applications. And as long as your application fits a certain form or model, the container will know what to do with it and be able to give it services. And in the context of EE, that really is things like injection security and transactions, some of the other services we mentioned before. So if we were to take this broad scope and then look again at what Java EE is, it's just a collection of specifications that let us write our business logic as components. It lets us do less, lets us write less, and we put more and more effort on the containers and metadata and less onto our own development practices, right? So then what's an application server? It's very, very simple. An application server is something that brings services to your applications. It's the container, and that's it. But we have a very, very bad idea, a very bad taste in our mouth about what an application server has become. You know, it is not necessarily big, bulky, cumbersome, slow. It's not all these terrible adjectives. It's just kind of become that over the past few years as the specs are large. And people started to tack on more and more stuff onto their application servers. So we don't need to do that anymore. And we took a real hard look at the application servers we were putting out. And even though we felt that they were great, realized that we could do a lot better in terms of making them smaller and a little bit more transparent. So, hey, here's JBoss Application Server 7. For the first time in years, it was written from scratch, a straight-up blank repository, but by the same team that's been doing AS4 and 5 and 6, we understand the domain problems with Java EE. So we approached these problems from a new perspective, right? And what we've come up with are really 7 key concepts that we've baked into JBoss AS7, and we're going to see them today, right? The first one, very quickly, is efficiency. And we gain a lot of this from having had built a new kernel called the Modular Service Container. And it doesn't aim to be a general purpose IOC framework. It doesn't aim to be anything that it's not. It aims to be something that is small, lean, fast, and outperforms just about anything that would come against it. But really, it's going to be the underscore of the whole application server, right? It provides a whole bunch of services like installation, injection, lifecycle. There's a deployment mechanism as well. And this is what JBoss Application Server uses under the hood to install all of its services and have them talk with one another, right? The second side is modularity. Modularity deals with isolation of your classes, and everything about the -- class path option that we pass into the runtime really needs to go out to the window. Application class loading in Java is really being re-examined, heralded by specifications like OSGI and by our own implementations and by other vendors. We get to look at application deployments that can only see a very small scope, and they're not going to get to see everything in this hierarchical class loader view that you may take from a standard class loading approach. There's a great talk, which I've noted here, from JBoss World. Jason and David have done a great job explaining what modularity is all about, and that's another key cornerstone behind AS7. It's powered by JBoss Modules, which is our class loading implementation. It's modular, it's thread safe, it's concurrent, and it's fast. And that's another place that we really get our speed from, is when MSC is going to be loading up things, it's going to be doing it concurrently, and the class loading needs to be able to support that. The third side is going to be administration. With JBoss AS7, you're going to want to be able to administer it in a very sane way. So this amounts to a few different phases. One is configuration, where we've unified the config into single files. If you're familiar with the JBoss application server structure in the past, we've had configuration files, and they've been per subsystem. Here we give a unified view, and it's composed together by a set of XSDs that are all unified into one place. We have fine management baked in to the very core of what JBoss Application Server 7 is all about. And there's a command line interface, there's a web-based console, HTTP and Java APIs to be able to get at your deployments and configure them in a much more friendly way than we've seen in the past. And finally, we have different operational modes. Your classic standalone mode being the traditional JBoss AS process, right? And then there's the domain mode, which introduces a way to manage a series of different servers that are not necessarily clustered, but they are together managed as a group. The fourth side that we bring with JBoss Application Server is a series of services that are going to come out of the box. One of the most powerful things about Java EE is that it enables you to not plug in everything on your own. When you go into a servlet container, that's exactly what it is. It serves out servlets. And the second you want to go applying things like transaction or some sort of injection framework, you're going to be plugging that in on top of it. And it's our opinion that doing this really is a waste of time when we can provide everything for you in something that's just as lean, right? So we have services that we give you out of the box for free. One of them, Weld, which is our reference, which is our implementation and the reference implementation of the CDI specification, context and dependency injection. HornetQ for a fast JMS implementation. Infinispan for distributed data grids, caching. Hibernate, our JPA provider. Iron Jacquemart is our Java connector architecture implementation. RESTEasy implements JAX-RS, the web services REST. And great security, and of course all the usual suspects that you're used to seeing in an application container like EJB, a servlet container, JIND tree, and a transaction manager. The fifth side is that JBoss AS7 is going to be offering you a support path. As Burr mentioned earlier, AS7 is the baseline upon which EAP6 will be built. EAP6 going to be our enterprise application platform, version 6, implementing the EE6 specs, and it will be based off of AS7. So we like to think of AS7 as the alpha upstream for EAP, and it's going to give you a support path which really lets you know that you have a backstop. You have someone to call if things go wrong. The support engineers are amazing. I see them all the time, and what they do really is very impressive. The sixth side is we develop everything out in the open. If you're having a problem, you can come to us. We're available to chat. We're available to look over issues. We review patches. We do all this stuff in the open to try and get as much feedback as we can and run into errors as we see fit, make sure that we're serving the needs of the community, and that includes doing things like these webinars. We have great forums. We love to reach out and have you be a part of the process. Slide 7 is the focus of our talk today. It's about testability, but really I've probably mislabeled this slide because testability in and of itself is great for asserting a whole bunch of things, but to me, It's also a lifestyle. It's a way of developing applications where as you're developing them, you're sure that they're working, and then the second they do work, you know that the test is in place and it will continue to work because you've got a barrier. But there really is a missing link in Java Enterprise, which doesn't address testability. It doesn't address this type of development. And we have two projects today which, when combined and used with AS7, really blow open the door and tie the whole picture together. So first is shrink wrap. When we talk about testing, usually we talk about having to run a full build, and this is incredibly problematic. You're in your IDE, and you're coding away, and your mind is wrapped up in the problems of your business logic. And the second that you're done, the traditional way to do your testing is to leave the IDE and go back to your command line, or stay in the IDE and launch whatever your build is, assemble all your classes, wait for the build to finish, start the server, and then deploy into it. That's really going to take away your focus. It takes a lot of time, and even if the process itself is quick, it takes your attention away for just long enough that you lose the flow from what you're doing, and it's very distracting. And in the worst case scenario, you might not end up taking the time to write a test at all because to you it's just not worth it. So what shrink wrap does is provides a very simple Java API for representing archives. When you think about it, an archive like a jar or a war or an EAR file is really just a serialized series of bytes, and they live on disk. But what we've done here is given a virtual file system that enables you to skip that whole put on disk process and represent these bytes as a Java object, which is great, right? But the problem there is that you need to be able to deploy this, and that's where we enter with Arquillian. Arquillian is a test framework extension that acts as a container in and of itself. You know, I said earlier that a container is an application that provides services to other applications. And in this case, that absolutely holds true. Arquillian will take your test and become the container. It will provide you with injection. It will do things like start a server, stop a server, deploy into it. It handles the lifecycle and deployment operations of your backing server environment and abstracts it all away from you. So just like Java EE abstracts away a lot of the nitty-gritty details of doing plumbing and cross-cutting concerns, Arquillian does the same, but from within your test environment. So we're going to go into demos, but first, wanted to mention here, definitely we're way open to getting involved. If you see anything here that you like or really speaks to you, that's great. I see even a few of our contributors on the call today, and it's cool to see them joining us. So we're gonna shock right into the demos, and I think what I'm going to do first is go through a very simple demo first. Then we'll go to some questions, and then we're going to do a deep dive and show some real-world example type stuff, right? Because everyone's seen the whole Hello World example, and it's all very impressive in and of itself, but we're going to show you exactly the power that you can get and how little code you have to write to use it. So let's start with our first example right here. We have in front of us a very simple EJB. Doesn't get more simple than this. What this is, even if you're not familiar with EJB as a programming model, we have a simple class. It's a POJO. It doesn't extend from anything. It doesn't implement anything. And we have this stateless annotation, which marks it as an EJB, and this local bean annotation, which denotes that it's going to have a no interface view, meaning that users are going to use this class directly, or what appears to look to them like this class, right? And what this does is really very simple. It will take in a string name here and then prepend this prefix to it. So it will welcome us. That's fantastic. Let's add another layer. We have a servlet. This is a very simple servlet. It's going to serve, by this annotation here, the URL pattern welcome. So when we hit the welcome on our application, it will welcome whomever. And what this is going to do is it's going to take in the request. It's going to parse out the parameter for the name. And then it'll welcome the user by delegating the actual business logic over to the EJB. The EJB is right here and is provided via injection. So if we were to take a standard testing approach to test this whole thing, there'd be tremendous amount of boilerplate stuff involved, right? Let's say we're using JUnit. We're probably going to have to put in a before class lifecycle method to start up the container, before method to deploy into it. Then we're going to need to do some lookups if we want to directly find the EJB, so we need to get some sort of a Jindy naming context and look up the EJB to invoke upon it. And then afterwards we're going to have to do some cleanup, like undeploying and then shutting down the container. And that's really a lot of stuff to have to do in your test harness, and we don't believe that you should have to do it. So we're going to use Arquillian, and we'll take a look at what this test case can become. Again, when the whole focus is writing on business logic in a test environment, the whole focus becomes in writing test logic. So what do we do here? We have a very simple class, and we're going to denote that we're going to run this with Arquillian. This run with annotation is a standard JUnit annotation, which allows you to change from the default runner into the control of Arquillian, which is our own runner. Arquillian, in turn, is going to know that, all right, I'm going to have to start up a container here, and what it does is some class path inspection to see what container should I start, and it's going to be able to be configured. Once it configures itself from what's on the class path, it's going to look for this. It's a deployment annotation, and this is an Arquillian annotation called @deployment, which defines a web archive. We talked a little bit earlier about shrink wrap and how easy it is to make archives. Here's how we make our WAR. We simply create it, name it, throw a couple classes into it, and then return it. Arquillian is going to pick this up straight up as a Java object and deploy it into the container. Again, we don't want to be doing any lookups, so Arquillian's cool enough to inject this for us. We use the standard @EJB injection, which comes from the EE specs. We reuse it so it remains familiar and it looks like it fits the EE programming model. And here's where the test is going to receive an injection from Arquillian. So we really don't write any boilerplate stuff to start the container, deploy into it. We just have to define what the deployment is, and we can get our injections. And all we have to do that is put this one annotation on the top. Now we can write our test logic, and this is the bulk of our class right here. And you'll see that it's all test logic, and really nothing else. First, we're going to ensure that there's a welcome message, and we're going to get at it via the servlet just by executing a very simple URL and reading in the line. We can do something that's a little bit more complex if we were to use a proper HTTP client and like parse it out for the response or get an error code. But for our purposes here, this is just returning plain text. It'll be fine. We'll read in the read line and get the response. Same thing here, only this time we're going to get it directly at the EJB. And I'll show you why this is important in a moment. First, let's run this test. We'll show you how easy it is. We're going to go to run as JUnit. One of the core design considerations of Arquillian has been not to require any plugins for execution. So we don't have any IDE plugins in place here. We don't have any special Maven plugins or Maven config in place here. The only thing that we're doing is launching this as a standard JUnit runner that comes with Eclipse. I haven't added anything onto here. And this is how intelligent it is. I mean, this, as we see here, I logged out the contents of our test app. We see it deploy. We see it register the EJB. And then it's going to execute the tests, and it comes out right here. This is all running in AS7, and it all happened just as I was explaining it. It really is that quick. And when it comes to actual test execution times, these are happening in container, and each test is coming in at under a second. Let me show you something else that's really powerful about shrink wrap. We talked about not wanting to leave the IDE, and here's why. You want to be running your tests very often. And when there's high barriers to entry to running them, you're not going to run them so often. So let's say I were silly and I accidentally applied this business logic twice. That's kind of a silly change to make. Now, the IDE is doing incremental compilation for us. So that's already saved. I don't have to do a full build. But I know I've just made a change. And as I always make changes, I'm going to run some of the affected tests. And I'm going to run them quickly just to make sure that they're going. We want to make sure that we're running our tests as often as we can, and if they can run very quickly and easily, we're going to run them more often. The whole name of the game here is to fail fast. And here we see very quickly that I've exposed a problem. I haven't done a rebuild. I haven't issued a Maven lifecycle or an Ant, anything like that. All I did was click and save the file. And immediately I know, oh my gosh, I've just made some problem in integration. This is the real power of Arquillian. Arquillian is an integration test framework. Because it operates with a container, you don't have to deal with things in isolation. You don't have to write mocks. You're dealing with a real environment. And I can see right here that I've now broken the integration between my servlet and my AGB as they operate in the container. Now I know that the business logic is intact because when I go directly to the EJB, this works. So something's got to be broken in here, and it's not that hard for me to remember. They're like, oh yeah, I was kind of just in here, and I changed that. That broke something. I better put that back and then rerun this test again to make sure that it turns green and that we're going to be all okay. And once it is, we know that we can move on and go to other things. Again, fail fast is the name of the game. We want to make sure that we're catching our errors just as quickly as we can while our eyes are still on it, and that's how we prevent problems and allow ourselves to move faster. Who knows how much time this could have cost us if we caught it later in the night during a nightly build or the next day. We'd have to open it up again and try and unravel what we did, and there may be other commits laid atop of it and untangle. We've saved ourselves a tremendous amount of time right here. So I think this is a good break point to go take some questions and check in here with the Q&A before we dive into some much more real-world complex examples. And we'll show you really the power that Arquillian is going to unleash when you couple it with something like AS7.
Okay, great job, Andrew. And for those of you guys on the line, if you guys see that little question mark in your lower right-hand corner there for most of you, you can actually pop that little window open even as Andrew is demonstrating, and feel free to ask us a question through that channel. One question that we had up front is, I guess a comment and a question. Would it be possible for us to show us the dependencies, your POM XML for that little project? What aspects of shrink wrap and Arquillian, etc., has come into my development environment here? So I guess, is this a Maven-based project?
This is a Maven-based project. I'm going to open this for you, but I'm going to do so with the caveat that for the purposes of this webinar, I wanted to make sure I was using and validating against some upstream stuff which hasn't been released yet. So I've put a series of hacks into my POM, but I'll explain those to you.
I'm sure we've all seen unclean POM.
Yeah, well, this one is very not clean. I wasn't expecting someone to show my dirty laundry today, but that's okay. A lot of standard POM type stuff here. Actually, by the way, while we're here, let me show you something. This whole thing is available. I should really put this upstream. If anyone wants to fork this, they can see this URL right now. Or if you can't see the whole thing, it's github.com/alrubinger. This JBoss AS test example right now is loaded with default configuration and a very simple test. So it's a great jumping off point for AS7 if you want to start making your own tests. And that's what I based today's presentation upon. I'll also be updating it with the new AS release and some other stuff when this webinar is over and over the next week or so. So let's take a look at some of the interesting stuff. I've configured Surefire. I'm sure that we're all kind of familiar with what this is. Here's something I've done. I've configured the dependency plugin to get the application server and put it under our target directory. The application server is available in Maven as a zip, so all this does is it unpacks it for us in our target directory so that we don't have to manually go and install it. I talked a little bit earlier about how Arquillian doesn't depend on the Maven lifecycle. That's true. Arquillian doesn't depend on the Maven lifecycle at all, but for the project setup elements, we can rely upon that just to run Maven once, and it'll put everything in place, and then when you switch into the IDE, everything will work. All of this you can skip. This is some IDE configuration. This whole lifecycle mapping stuff is just configuring M2 Eclipse for the IDE.
And we're working on that here at JBoss. We're going to make that M2 Eclipse thing behave a bit better in the future.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I found some of these, there are errors that pop up, and if you put these in place, the errors go away. So that's nice. Again, in being true to form, sometimes I like to just use a stock Eclipse installation to show that it takes no special plugins to use Arquillian. But again, JBoss Tools, if you're doing any type of JBoss development, has an amazing suite of plugins that make development on JBoss-related products and in EE really, really helpful. So with regards to the dependency management question, here we are. We got JUnit, which is going to be the base of our test framework. This right here, JBoss AS Spec API, this is where JBoss Application Server exports the dependencies for the specification artifacts. These are things like the servlet annotation, the EJB annotation, any type of EE-related spec. This is where we export it from. This is probably the one hack I was talking about. We put this into import scope, and I put it here just for my project, but I'm not quite sure if it needs to be there. I put that in last night. This is a straight dependency upon the distribution. As we said, when we have Maven unzip it up here, that's all well and good, but you also need to have a dependency upon it to make sure that Maven downloads the thing first. This right here is one of two required Arquillian dependencies. This is the one that says we'll use JUnit. It also accepts TestNG, so you can pick your test framework of choice, and Arquillian will work with it. So here's where we tell Arquillian, hey, we're going to use JUnit, so put in some of the Arquillian JUnit support. And this right here is the backing Arquillian container for AS7. This is the thing that says when Arquillian boots up, it's going to say, all right, I want to have control over this, and I need to boot up a container. What am I going to boot? By class path inspection, Arquillian is going to know because this is here, we're going to use AS7. And this is another one of the hacky points that I've put in place, and I'm not sure if it's necessary, but I put it in last night, and I wasn't expecting on.
And I think that addresses the basic question. Mostly what are the dependencies, shrink wrap, Arquillian, that kind of thing. And you made a great point during your presentation there in the demonstration that one of the reasons people have avoided automated testing and in their applications is because they take too long to run, and mock objects are a real pain to maintain. And we have one question here from Noah. He basically says, or she, hopefully I got that right. So the container is started, and you say no mocks are needed. This means I can also test code that requires JPA integration, right?
That's a fantastic question. I mean, it actually leads into my next example. So if there's any other questions on the doc, we can put that one aside for a second, and I'll address it. Or and then, dive into it.
And Greg notes that he saw some red error messages that showed up on the console when the test ran initially, when the server was booting up. At least that's where it appeared on the console.
This right here is some of the, there's just a logger warning, but they come up red. I'm not sure why this part comes up red.
Okay.
I think this has to do with because from the time I launched the test, I would ignore it. It's straight up before JBoss logging takes over, that's regular test output, and then the JBoss logging appender takes over, and that's when everything turns black and gets the nice formatting.
Okay, and you're right, it doesn't look like anything serious there to me.
Yeah.
Another question is, can Arquillian and shrink wrap work with something prior to AS7?
Yeah.
AS6, AS5?
Yeah, we have connectors for, I'm going to list off the top of my head now. We have connected, the whole beauty of it is that you'll see in my test case, take a look at the imports, you won't see anything that notes AS7 in here at all. The test case is completely abstracted away from the container, and the class itself doesn't know anything about it. So that was another great design consideration, and we noticed how I have that one dependency in place for the AS7 managed container. We also have connectors for AS6. We have connectors for other vendors, for Glassfish and for OpenEJB. And if you go to jboss.org/Arquillian or just arquillian.org, you'll be able to go into the docs and see there's a matrix of all the supported containers and the versions and everything.
Okay. And one other quick question. I think you covered most of the questions, and Noah wanted to make sure that I understood that it's a she. Thank you very much for that, Noah. But are there anything like this to test ESB services, JBoss ESB or perhaps other ESBs?
I will defer to Aslak, our lead. I want to introduce, by the way, Aslak is our lead of Arquillian and also on the line. So if he wants to jump in at any point for these Q&A type stuff, Aslak, you can feel free to go right ahead.
Yeah, hey everyone. For ESP services, there's a new, what's the name? New switchyard. ESP core that is coming out will have a test suite as well based on Arquillian. There's nothing in place in Arquillian itself today to test ESPs in themselves, but it supports deploying any type of deployment, so you can deploy whatever you want and test them as the remote endpoints.
Oh, very good. I think that's a good point. Shrink-wrap does have some of that integration, but that's our upstream project. It's called Shrink-wrap. It's a replacement for JBoss ESB in the future, and that'll be part of SOAR Platform 6. So that was for Paulo. He was specifically asking about, what can I do around ESB services and specifically SOAR Platform 5. So it looks like you're going to have to wait a little bit longer, or you can probably write some of the Arquillian plugins yourself and extend it to support the older ESB if you need to.
And one tiny correction there, Bert. The ESB project is Switchyard. Shrink-wrap is the Java Archives project that acts as the deployment mechanism for Arquillian.
Oh, did I say shrink-wrap instead of switchyard?
I do stuff like that all the time. We have way too many projects in JBoss. We're just awesome all the way over, and it's hard to keep it straight.
Well, fantastic. Show us your next demo.
All right, so let's get on over to the JPA stuff. That previous demo is really well and good for nothing more than demonstration purposes. I don't know anyone in a straight-up business sense who is writing an application that will say hello. I do know people that are integrating with JPA, though, and what I'm going to show you now is a fairly involved test case. And before we see it, I'd just like to note that, yes, the test case is involved, but the test case is involved because we're stretching some very serious test logic, not because we have a whole lot of setup or harness-type stuff in place. So what we're going to do is deploy a lot of JPA entities. We're adding these things by package even. And we'll even make up some data for the tests. In this case, we deal with something called an employee. So an employee, very classically has like an ID and a name. But there's many different types of employees, and then there's all sorts of different mapping strategies that we've used here. One is a single class, table per class, joined. I've mapped these in just about every way under the sun, and this particular example comes from chapters 9 through, I believe, 14 of the EJB 3.1 book. So let's take a look. The key to testing entities is that you need to be doing so within the context of a transaction. So for anyone familiar with JPA, a JPA entity is a straight-up Java POJO. It's a regular object that you can create using the new operator. You don't get it from anywhere fun. But when it becomes associated with something called an entity manager, it becomes what they call managed. And when it is managed, it means that all these state changes that are happening in that little POJO are tracked by the entity manager and synchronized with the running transaction. And when the running transaction is about to complete, the entity manager is going to examine the change in state that needs to take place, and it's going to issue updates or deletes. It's going to pull things in, right? So we need to be making sure that we're actually doing our testing in the course of a transaction. So what I've done here is I've made a very simple EJB called a TX wrapper and another one called an EM hook. What do these do? Well, very simply, they're going to expose out parts of our container to our test. The entity manager hook is going to allow us to get at the entity manager in our test. And the transaction wrapper is going to allow us to submit callables. If anyone is familiar with this right here, that is Java util concurrent callable. And it has one method called call. And you can put any arbitrary code in it, and it will execute within the course of a transaction. So let's take a look at a kind of a simple case here. This one is called persist and modify employees. So what we're going to do first is define a transaction and then wrap in that transaction one callable. And this callable is going to do some very simple stuff. It's going to create 3 new employees with IDs and names. it's going to get at the entity manager. First, it's going to perform an insertion just to show that we're clear on the start. We should not be able to find Dave through the database yet because we haven't added him yet. We should also make sure that that this is not managed. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and persist these guys. And we'll note that they're added. And that's going to be it for our first transaction. We even perform a little assertion that says, like, hey, yeah, now they're managed. Now we're going to fire up another transaction within the same test case. And this transaction is going to say, all right, let's try and find Dave. This is going to make sure that because now we're in the context of a different transaction, that when we actually did our persistence, it's persisted in the database across transactional boundaries. If you remember the ACID properties of a transaction, they're atomic, they're consistent, they're isolated, right? So this isolation factor is what we're really testing here, is to make sure that, like, yeah, we can see whatever we want in the context of this transaction through the entity manager, but is that going to be, when that transaction finishes, is that going to be now become visible to the rest of the system in other transactions? And that's going to assert right here that, like, yeah, we can find Dave. We can continue along and do some more fun stuff. We changed Dave's name right here. We're going to set Dave a new name. And we're going to let that transaction finish, and then in a new transaction again, make a new employee here, merge them up, and detach it, and set to a dummy value. Why not come again with another transaction? Do another check. We changed Dave's name when the entity was not managed and not attached, so we're going to make sure that the changes that we made weren't actually flushed out, and that's what we do in this transaction. In this transaction here, we'll have Rick leave the company, and we'll delete the record. And in this transaction, we'll make sure that because he's deleted, we can't find him anymore. So we've just gone through a whole bunch of different cases, and you see very clearly that, like, while the test cases themselves may be a little bit asinine for, like, finding someone or deleting them or changing the name, here in the test, you've got very clear control over your transactional boundaries and what exactly you're testing with JPA. And we can do all sorts of stuff. This one right here is going to make sure that we're auto-genning a primary key from a map superclass. This one here tests how to use an external composite primary key. These are some of the more advanced features of JPA, and we can test them all. Because we're in the container, we have access to all the internals that we choose to expose out into the test. Burr, how are the questions looking for this? Am I losing anyone? Is there any more detail? Am I going too slow, too fast?
No, I think we're great here. The only question that's come up so far is, this is great, but what about JMS resources as well?
The short answer for that is absolutely. I mean, because, again, we are in the container. Anything that you expose out into your test, you can test. I didn't happen to prep the JMS example for today's webinar, but I did do a transactions one. But yeah, short answer, absolutely. Anything that is in the container that you want to expose out in some way to your test, you'll have full access and control over. Is that going to do it for the questions, Burr?
Sure, please continue on.
Okay. This will be our last example for the day, as you see that we're kind of getting towards the end of the hour. This is going to model a transactional blackjack game. Blackjack is a game played at casinos, and what I've done here is I've modeled it in an EJB. Now, EJB is a pretty powerful component model, and it applies transactional boundaries in a default way. And the default is, if there's a transaction in play, use it. If not, create a new transaction. Those are some pretty great transactional semantics for most EJBs, but not in the case of our blackjack game. Because what if I were to say, all right, I'm going to play 100 hands of blackjack. And I go to the casino, and by the 88th game of blackjack, I'm down $3,000. If there's an error thrown by the system or something bad happens on that 89th game, it would throw a transaction, it would throw an exception, and roll back my whole history. And if you're a casino, this is not the desired thing, because then they've just lost $3,000 that they've really already won. So what we're going to do with this transactional blackjack game integration test is make sure that the transactional configuration for our blackjack EJB is correct. And we do that using some of our old friends. Here's that entity manager hook. Here's that transaction wrapper. I also made this thing called a DB initializer. This is just a really simple old EJB that I created to pre-populate the database with some default data. I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways you can do this. There's whole test frameworks that specialize in doing this. But for me, for this, it was just so easy to make a little singleton bean, which on startup is going to put a whole bunch of stuff in the database. We also have a bank EJB, and then finally the blackjack game, right? So let's go get on into the tests. First, we're going to test that bank transfers are going to retain their integrity, right? So all this test is doing here is it's going to do some very simple stuff. See if I can outline it quickly. Transfer $100 from one account to another, and then we'll just execute in the course of a transaction, a test, to subtract this here and put some stuff here. We're going to check to make sure that we got the right type of exception right here. Again, I'm kind of going through this quickly because the test logic isn't nearly as important as we can understand that we're executing stuff within a transaction. Arbitrary code we're wrapping up in a transaction and executing. You know, we can catch exceptions and unwrap them from within the test because the test is in the container. This is a type of testing that I haven't seen anywhere before. This is the big test we really have to test, right? This is the big assertion we have to make. A sequence of bets isn't going to roll back the previous history. I have a little task here called the place 11 bets then force exception task, meaning we're going to bet this amount. This is a type of task that implements callable, and in the call method it runs a loop to do the whole 11 bets, and then we'll manually do a forced text exception so that we can emulate an unexpected error. But here we're actually controlling it. And, and here we're going to catch that error, make sure that we got it, and then after we get that error, we're going to check the balances and make sure that they are as we're expecting. And this is really very important because all we're doing here is setting up this type of test logic, and it's going to test that our EJBs are properly configured with those cross-cutting concerns, those transactional semantics. Because it's so easy for a newbie developer to come on in, not understand simple annotation atop an EJB class, and remove it or change it or do something. With this test in place, you're going to see that you've got an error. So you're not just testing the business logic, you're also testing the configuration for the whole system, which is going to potentially have catastrophic problems if you don't change it.
What about data sources? That question has come in. Where would I configure the data source to be used in the test here?
Okay, so this first one here is the JPA test, right? And as you see here, I'm adding as a manifest resource this persistence XML.
Okay.
In this example, I've just used the straight-up default data source that comes with JBoss AS7. But if you want to go in and configure your own data source or deploy your own data source, then you would do that in much the same way. It would be part of your deployment, or you could get it from inside the container and do some. We talked a little bit about the AS7 management and configuration interfaces. So from within the test, maybe you get at it through that way if you want to do some configuring online while it's there, or just add it to your deployment and not use example DS.
How would you handle loading some default data, some data that my test expects to be there and in place before I run my test?
So that's what I did here with this. This is one approach. This is probably the most bespoke and hacky of approaches, this DB initializer bean. That's a simple thing that I wrote here. For very simple tasks like cleanup and populating with default data, I can do it just in Java code like this. Otherwise, plug in some sort of a thing, DB unit maybe. for the purposes of this, I didn't want to bring in another framework. It was easy enough to just put in some data. Alternatively, you could even do another manual approach if you have like an SQL dump set or something like that. You can load that in as a file. I mean, again, this is just a standard JUnit or TestNG test. So however you would ordinarily get it some default data store and then throw that in, however you get the data is going to be the same, but we're going to give you some extra facilities for actually interacting with the database through the entity manager and any of your other container facilities.
All right, very good.
Does that clear the deck for us, Burr?
Yes.
Well, I think that really is everything I wanted to show everyone today. Again, we're crazy excited about what we're able to offer here. To recap a little bit, with JBoss AS7, we've got a runtime that's really very slim, very fast, very capable of being executed quickly and often. And what we've done is we've taken our development solutions in Arquillian and shrink-wrap and applied that on top and given what we believe is the best in the Java EE landscape for doing development of Java Enterprise Platform. We want to be able to make sure that you are writing your tests very quickly, that you want to write them, that you're able to write code that is clean and understandable and secure, all these things. And your test should be able to take advantage of the component model of Java EE, and that's really what we're all about. So again, we're really very happy to have you as contributors. We are on IRC in Freenode at #JBoss-AS7 or #JBoss testing at one word. I'm on Twitter at @ALRubinger. I'm sure if you do some Googling after the session, you'll be able to find us. And get involved, contribute. Shrink-wrap in particular requires no external dependencies. If you can code in Java, you can become a contributor to shrink-wrap and get involved in open source programming. It's incredibly fulfilling, and it really ties you in and makes you a much better programmer, in my opinion. So get involved. We'd love to hear your feedback, and thanks everyone for joining.
All right, thank you guys very much. And we did have a couple more questions come in. And so, Andrew, I would just get your opinion on this particular question, and that is related to migration. So we've seen some great stuff from AS7 today, and we've been talking about it in our series now for a while. If I'm an App Server 5.1 user, App Server 6 user, what are your recommendations from a migration strategy standpoint for me to move to AS7?
I think that depends a lot on if it's already in production, if you need support, this type of thing. AS7 for me is definitely something I would be trying to base all my future developments upon because it is our upstream. It is just so many leagues better than anything that we've been able to offer previously. The AS6 stream is still getting issued some releases, but that's not going to keep up for forever. And AS7 really is the path forward. The only way I would say to not jump in right away is if you had an app in production and needed a support contract now, EAP6. When EAP6 falls, that would be the time frame then when I would say, yeah, go right ahead. But as I said earlier, and has also been said by Burr and our lead of AS7, Jason Green, AS7 is kind of like the alpha for EAP6. So if you want to know what's coming down the line, if you want to get involved from a community perspective, throw it in there. And hey, look at all the stuff we've showed you with Arquillian and also with this right here, that JBoss AS test example. Start small. JBoss AS7 is not all that difficult to get into. Start deploying some of your applications into it and use Arquillian and deploy subsets of your application into it and see what's running and what's not and what you need to do to make adjustments for.
Okay, well that's all the time we have today. So again, thank you very much. I enjoyed the demonstrations. I always like seeing a demo-oriented presentation from our core team because then you get a chance to see as a viewer what it really looks like. And I like the Maven integration, the IDE integration. Actually seeing that green bar versus red bar in the IDE makes a big difference when it comes to looking at my test and seeing if it succeeded or failed. So thank you for that. And again, everybody on the line, look forward to seeing you guys again in September when we bring up our next topic, which will be JBoss Platform as a Service. And if you guys have other topics you're interested in, please email those into me or tweet them into me in some form or fashion. You can also hit us at JBoss Developer. I monitor that channel closely. So if you have information for us, feel free to send that in. Again, thank you guys very much. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Aslak.
Thank you, Burr.
Thank you.